In this video today, I'll be going through this Speed Paint Mega Set by Army Painter. I'll be going through some of the practical uses of the range, plus my usual tips and tricks, as well as give my thoughts and opinions on this set, and why these are not just what I first thought they were going to be towards the end of the video. Let's go. First off, let's check out the box. It makes it nice and clear on the back as to what paints you get, and it comes with a free brush. It states a one coat and you're done to your painting. So in theory, it should mean that you'll finish your projects even quicker. Maybe that's why they called it Speed Paint. Inside we get two plastic trays of paints that consist of 23 colours and a mixing medium. And as always from Army Painter, this useful book that tells you about the range and painting techniques. I think this is great for both beginners and anyone coming over to the range for the first time. You also get a Wargaming monster brush and this handy quick guide to the paints. One of the things that I love about these dropper bottles that the majority of the paint brands use these days is that if you accidentally knock them over, they won't make a mess and ruin your painting area. Also, you can hold them upside down and they won't do anything until you give them a bit of a squeeze. One thing that should be said is they come with mixing balls, which helps mix the paint up as you shake them. Don't throw these away once your paint finishes though, just wash them off and pop them into another bottle. For the video, I've applied all the colours onto some miniatures so you can see them over the next few photos. And feel free to pause the video and take a look at each one for a closer view. Now, coming into this, my expectations are that this is a one coat and you are done painting solution. So it should be good to get projects done quicker. Let's dive into it. One question that I've seen crop up a few times is what the paint range is like compared to its shade paint's counterpart. For this example, Blood Red was faced off against Red Tone, and we are going to experiment on 4 Moria goblins that have been sprayed white. Because the mega set comes with some medium, I'm going to use this to thin down our speed paint a little, and show you what happens also when you use water. The first goblin had Blood Red doused all over it, and you can immediately see how the paint starts to work. Because of its unique properties, the colour is easy to apply and goes into the recessed areas nicely. If you add too much paint to one area, like this for example, then wipe the brush with a tissue or back on the palette and allow the paint to soak back into the bristles as you prod it into those areas. Next, we shall add a few drops of medium into our Blood Red and see how this applies. For this experiment, it would be a ratio of around about 2 parts of paint to 1 part of medium. As the paint is applied, you can immediately see it is more translucent and allowing more of the white undercoat to be seen. Again, it sinks into the recesses nicely, but the top surface is not covered as much. This potentially could be a good use for a glaze, especially on a metallic armour. Now for the water version. Using the same amount as the medium before, to keep things consistent, it was painted onto our goblin. This now is acting more like a wash, and I would expect this to happen. Barely any paint is sitting on the top surface of the miniature, and it is sinking perfectly into the recesses of the details. If this dries okay, then I can think of instantly this being a whole set of new coloured shade paints in my arsenal to use for future projects. Finally, our good old red tone shade paint was used for our last goblin. And as we expect, the paint flows into the recesses nicely, creating those shaded areas, just as a shade paint would. Once these sacrificial test goblins have all dried up, we can compare them. So you can see from the image that the Blood Red speed paint does exactly what it says on the box. It base coats the miniature, the paint gathers more into the recesses and creates a shade, and then it is more translucent on the edges of the details to create that subtle highlight. Using some medium with the paint takes this further, and the highlights become more prominent on the miniature, whilst making the overall paint more translucent to see the colour underneath. Adding water, however, turns the paint more into a type of shade paint, so you can apply the washes onto your miniatures with even more colours now. And you can see how they all compare to the standard shade paint on the right. So that's one paint. Let's see what it's like with the multiple paints. I wanted to revisit a Moria goblin that I painted a few videos back and try and replicate this as close as possible with just the speed paints. To keep the experiment the same, the miniature would be sprayed gunmetal first, just like the other one. For the most part, this turned out nicely, with some positive results. The green is nice and vibrant, so this could certainly be used to create a variety of skin tones for the army. The red cloth has a subtle tint of metallic where the highlights would be, which doesn't show when it's a couple feet away, such as a gaming table, but I think I would highlight the cloth regardless to tie them into the rest of the army, as this wouldn't take long to do. At the moment, you are viewing the miniatures from about 10 centimeters away from the lens, so we are scrutinizing them at pretty close range. If I pull them back to around about a foot away, there is little to no difference between the two. Except one took about 1/3 of time to paint than the other. And if I can save time painting miniatures, then that will allow me to have more time to buy more miniatures and paint even more. So from this first experiment, we can now apply this knowledge onto the next section, and that is working with a metallic base coat. This Minas Tirith warrior just needs the recesses painting and doesn't need a full base coat to be applied. So from our red goblin experiment earlier, we know that if we use a grim black and some medium for this, then we can paint it onto his armor. As the paint is applied, it sits nicely into the recesses of the armor, leaving the top areas looking like they have been highlighted already. The cloth needs to be darker, so a full layer of grim black straight out of the bottle was applied here. Now we know in advance that the creases in the cloth will still be visible and a small amount of metal will still be seen on the highlights, which is why we are going to highlight it with a normal paint afterwards. I also tested out to see if using a hairdryer would speed up the drying time, and it worked perfectly. It dried in less than a minute, but I would say at this point don't use your hairdryer at full blast, as the paint will move around. A quick highlight of grey was used and the cloth was done. Overall, you can see how quick it would be to paint a whole miniature. And if you have a warband to do, then I would consider buying another, as you won't have anything to paint soon after these techniques. Afterwards, I had some fun and experimented a bit more. Using plasmatic bolt and water, I tinted the metals on the right hand side slightly to see how transparent the colour would look over the top. For the left hand side, the plasmatic bolt was mixed with some medium, and you can see the difference between the two and also the potential that it has. This could be pretty cool for some sci-fi looking miniatures, perhaps some marines in space, or something like that. Whilst having some Minas Tirith warriors at hand, I thought let's try and make some gold. And Sandgolem was the paint of choice for this. For the benefit of this video, and for me not to sit at my desk waiting for the paint to dry, I gave the miniatures a blast from the hairdryer to speed things up. The miniature on the left had another layer added to some of the areas using Sandgolem again. I wanted to see if this would change the overall colour and or the shade of the paint. To my pleasant surprise, it came out more brassy looking, which is what this video is all about, experimenting and having a play. So that being said, I will answer another question that I've seen floating around on the internet. Does water affect speed paint after it's been applied onto the miniature? Let's test this out. I'm going to add a few drops of water onto a tissue and try rubbing the paint off with it. And yes, it does come off, which unfortunately means that I will not be able to game with these in the bath. However, it should be said, do watch out when you have multiple speed paints on your palette, because they can reactivate when you brush them around. And I wanted to show you this here, so keep them separate as you paint. And now with this newfound knowledge, I know exactly what to experiment with next. This 𝗷𝗚 warrior was sprayed with gunmetal. To give it that grimy, dark looking armor, some dark wood was applied and then some grim black into some recesses to make it even darker. Now, knowing that the speed paint can rub off, and with water this is a definite, I decided to try something here. So, using a very 𝗪𝗇𝗻 looking brush and dampening it ever so slightly, I effectively used a dry brush method and went around the armoured section of the miniature. This then lifted off some of the edges of the armour, exposing the original metallic paint underneath. And this created a quick looking highlight. and for an evil miniature, I think this technique is pretty good. So I decided to take this one step further. This time, prodding the damp brush onto the surface of the shield allowed me to chip away some paint and create a battered look. And for those of you with a grim dark disposition of 40k and other sci-fi genres, you could make your armor look worn very quickly with little effort. This experiment was unexpected, and maybe one of my favourite outcomes whilst putting this video together. After playing around with the speed paints for the morning, I wanted to get some hobby done, and then I felt confident enough to apply a few of these techniques onto my first set of miniatures, which were some Warriors of the Dead. Knowing that the speed paints act somewhat like a filter, allowing the layer underneath to be seen, the warrior was painted with a zenithal highlight in mind, using a makeup brush. You can certainly do this with a spray can or an airbrush too if you prefer. The first layer of paint was applied and you can see straight away the variation of shade on the miniature. This makes it a useful paint range to get a nice looking miniature done quickly. So if you are a hobbyist with lots of plastic miniatures ready to paint up, then this paint range will be one way to get your collection looking amazing in no time. Now, let's talk about speed paint and if it can reactivate a previous layer of paint. I have noticed this by brushing multiple layers on at the same point. And this is exactly what I needed when I painted this goblin. Here, I applied a holy white layer to the bow, and this enabled me to create a lighter gradient towards the tips for the wood. I also tested this on a miniature that was painted earlier in the morning. This goblin has been dry for around about 6 hours or so, and some speed paint was added on to see if it would blend or react. It did not. However, what can occur is that you could potentially rub off the paint towards the edges with a finger. So maybe the paint does somehow soften. I would suggest to be careful if you come back to a miniature and paint extra parts, if you are prone to touching the miniature as you paint, like me. Now to avoid this, you could spray a coat of varnish and then this will protect the layer underneath. And then paint another layer on afterwards. On this Warrior of the Dead, there are 3 different colours of speed paint going from light to dark, all on top of each other. The way that I painted this was just to do one thin layer, let it dry, and then do another thin layer afterwards, and not to do multiple brush strokes on one specific area. I think the main thing to take away from this is to experiment. Have a go and see what works for you and what doesn't. For me, I was pleasantly surprised when I got stuck in and just painted some miniatures. One of the negative points, well, I would say they're more like observations really, as a lot of these paints are pretty dark on the palette. Just make sure you keep track of which ones you are using so you don't use the wrong one. So before making this video, I thought that these were just going to be a simple one paint of coat is all that you're going to need. And I quickly discovered that there are multiple ways of using them, and I'm sure I've only just scratched the surface in this video. Will I just be using these paints by themselves and nothing else? No. But I will certainly use them within my current paint range, and I feel like it's given me permission to experiment a little bit more and paint miniatures in a new way, and I think it'll push me forward as a miniature painter. So, are these speed paints for beginners? No and yes. Let me explain. I think these are great if you want to get through miniatures quickly and you're happy by just applying a single coat of paint. But for beginners, I think these paints are slightly unforgiving as you have to be neat from the start, which not all new hobbyists are. I mean, my first painted Space Marine. On the flip side, however, these could be a really useful tool for a beginner as it'll encourage them to paint with a brush neatly from the get-go, which would propel their skills quicker and they will be more confident with their hand-to-eye coordination, especially on those miniatures that have super crazy details. So what do you guys think about the new paints? Will you be getting them, or do you want to see them in action a bit more through various videos? If you do have any questions, then please do ask in the comments below and I'll make sure I get back to you. And if you're feeling super generous, then please do check out the links in the description below and you'll be helping me by helping you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.